welcome back to Simply Biology. In today's video we're going to be looking at classification. We're going to be looking at what classification is, what is a species with the biological and the phylogenetic species concept. We're also going to be looking at a bit about classification, analysing the different taxa, and then we're also going to be looking at the evidence used for classification and comparing those to one another. So, without further ado, let's get started. So first, classification. Classification is the process of grouping organisms together, and the smallest unit of classification is known as the species. We'll come to the taxa later on, but firstly, what is a species? So, a species have several different definitions, and the two I'm going to talk about today are both the biological species concept and the phylogenetic species concept. So the biological species concept defines a species as having similar morphological, ecological, biochemical, and physiological characteristics. The organisms should be able to breed successfully interbreed and to produce fertile offspring. However, a disadvantage of this species concept is that it does not consider those species or organisms which can reproduce asexually. So therefore, we have what's known as the phylogenetic species concept. The phylogenetic species concept states that groups of organisms with similar evolutionary history and with a similar common ancestor are considered members of the same species. This, however, has the advantage of incorporating both organisms that reproduce asexually and sexually. So we're now going to look at the classification system and the heredity of classification. So we have different groups that these are each known as taxa, and as you go down the taxa, the organisms and the species get more closer together. So the first one is the kingdom. You've then got the phylum, you've then got the class, you've then got the order, you've then got your family, your genus, and your species. And you can remember that King Philip came over for good soup. So, there's also been recently a scientist called Carl Woese proposed a modification to this classification system, adding a taxa domain at the front by separating species and organisms into three different domains, which are known as eukaryota. Prokaryota are split into two groups known as eubacteria and archaea. So that means you have three domains altogether. You have eubacteria and archaea, and then you have eukaryota, which incorporates all eukaryotic organisms, whereas the two prokaryotic are separated in either eubacteria, because they have non-coding DNA within their genetic sequence, or archaea, which have no non-coding RNA in their genome. So we're now going to look at the evidence used in classification. So scientists can analyse the DNA and the nucleotide sequence of organisms. The more similar the two organisms' DNA sequence, the more recently they evolved from a recent common ancestor. And this helps to group species together because the genomes of over 100 animal species are now known. And this helps scientists to classify organisms with a high level of accuracy. We can also look at protein/amino acid sequence. So the same proteins are present in virtually all organisms. However, the amino acid sequence can vary between those organisms. Therefore, the more similar the amino acid sequence is, the more recently those two species have evolved from a common ancestor. You've then got what's known as anatomical evidence, which is analysing the physical characteristics of the organism, and this was first proposed by a scientist known Aristotle in ancient Greek. And what difficulty with this is, though, you can have something what's known as convergent evolution, where two species or two organisms that are not closely related develop similar characteristics and therefore look alike, and therefore may be incorrectly labelled as members of the same species when actually they don't share very much in common with each other. And another problem of this is that members of the same species can look entirely different. So an example of this is the differences between the ants. You've got the queen ant, you've got the worker ants, and you've got the soldier ants. And all these ants are members of the same species but look very different because they perform entirely different roles. We now also have what's known as fossil evidence. So fossil evidence, depending on the age of the fossil, DNA may still be intact if the half-life hasn't depleted, and therefore DNA and molecular testing can be conducted on the fossil. However, if not, the scientists need to rely on looking at the physical characteristics and comparing them, and this can lead to what's known as different interpretations in competing theories of evolution. You then also got the concepts of immunological evidence, behavioural evidence, and embryonic evidence. Embryonical evidence just suggests that early embryos of different organisms look alike. So most eukaryotic embryos have developed a tail, which is then slowly retracted and as development in the embryo continues. But this early embryos of different species can look alike, which identifies those species as having a recent common ancestor. Now, finally, we can use what's known as a DNA barcode to examine and classify species. So a DNA barcode is a short sequence of DNA that has to be 4 different things. It has to be universal, so it's present in most taxa. It has to be short and quick to analyse. It has to show a large variation between species and little variation within a species. Therefore, scientists use what's known as cytochrome C oxidase, which is a gene found in mitochondrial DNA. Now, mitochondrial DNA has a faster mutation rate than normal nuclear DNA, and therefore it can show more variation between these species, but a little variation within a species. That are 2 of the 4 things that a DNA barcode has to have. So, however, in plants, this gene does not show such a fast mutation rate. So what you can use is genes such as RBCL or MATK, which have a faster mutation rate for plants. So thank you for watching this video, and I hope you now